So for about a decade now, China has been quietly building one of the biggest oil stockpiles in the world. On the surface, it looks like a brilliant strategic move. But here's the question we're going to dig into. Is this massive reserve really a fortress of energy security? Or is it actually a kind of trap, a wasting asset with a ticking clock?
First, let's just appreciate the sheer scale of this thing. We're talking about roughly 1.2 billion barrels of oil that's held in a mix of government-controlled strategic reserves and commercial storage. To put that in perspective, it's the largest non-US strategic reserve on the planet. It looks like an incredible display of foresight and power. Or at least, that's how it's supposed to look.
And what's really fascinating is how they built this thing. They didn't just go out and buy oil on the open market like everyone else. Nope. This massive reserve was pieced together over 10 years by scooping up the cheapest, most controversial barrels on Earth. We're talking heavily discounted crude from sanctioned countries like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela.
You know, U.S. House Select Committee report really put it perfectly. They said China assembled this stockpile from the very barrels that Western sanctions were supposed to take off the market. And from a certain point of view, it was a genius move, right? Buy up the oil that nobody else wanted, get it at a rock-bottom price, and just sit on it for a rainy day.
So, on the surface, the story seems pretty clear. It's a masterclass in long-term strategy. Building this huge buffer against global energy shocks looks like a total win for Beijing. But, and this is a really big but, this is where the story starts to get a whole lot more complicated. Because you have to ask the one question that changes the entire equation. Is 1.2 billion barrels, as mind-bogglingly huge as that sounds, actually enough to solve China's real energy problems?
Okay, so to really get to the bottom of this, we've got to do some math. We need to figure out what this stockpile really means in practical terms. What happens if, one day, all of China's foreign oil imports just stopped?
And look, the math here is actually pretty simple. China's refineries are thirsty. They need about 15.5 million barrels every single day to keep running. But China only produces about 4.3 million barrels at home. So right there, you've got this massive gap. They need to import about 11.2 million barrels a day just to break even.
So you take that 1.2 billion barrel stockpile, you divide it by that daily need of 11.2 million barrels, and what do you get? The answer is about 107 days. So let's call it a runway of about 3.5 months.
Over 100 days of energy security. More than 3 months. That sounds pretty comfortable, doesn't it? Well, this is exactly where that stroke of genius plan starts to show some really serious cracks.
You see, the first big problem isn't really about how many days they have. It's about money. There's a massive, and I mean massive, financial penalty for ever actually using this oil. And here's the core issue. A strategic reserve isn't some magical, bottomless oil well you can just draw from forever. Every single barrel that China takes out of that stockpile to get through a crisis, well, they eventually have to go out and buy another one to put it back.
Just think about the price tag on that for a second. China bought most of this oil for a steal, right? Maybe $50, $60 a barrel. But to replace it after a crisis, they'd be buying oil when prices are through the roof, let's say over $100 a barrel. So if they use just 200 million barrels, the extra cost to refill the tank could be somewhere around $8 to $10 billion. Ouch!
But honestly, that huge financial hit is nothing compared to the strategic dilemma this creates. This right here is the absolute heart of the problem. This reserve has two jobs, and that forces Beijing's leaders into an almost impossible choice. You have to understand, this giant stockpile wasn't just built to handle a supply disruption from a war in the Middle East. It was built with another, much bigger, and maybe more existential threat in mind. So the reserve is designed to do two huge and very different things. Job number one, absorb a major supply shock. You know, like if a conflict shuts down the Strait of Hormuz. Job number two, help China survive a potential conflict over Taiwan where it could face a full-blown international blockade. And here's the multi-trillion-dollar question. Can one pile of oil really cover both of those massive scenarios? And the short answer is no way. It's a classic zero-sum game. Using the reserves to handle a crisis today in the Middle East directly eats into the buffer they've set aside for a potential Taiwan conflict tomorrow. Every barrel used for one problem is a barrel they don't have for the other.
And this fact completely changes how we should think about this stockpile. It's not some static source of strength. It's really more of a wasting asset. With every day that a crisis drags on, its strategic value ticks down, and the political cost of actually using it just goes up.
You can see how this puts Beijing in a really tough spot. If they tap into the reserve for a short-term crisis, it screams vulnerability to the whole world, which could make oil prices spike even more. It drains that crucial cushion they need for Taiwan. And all the while, the financial and political price tag for making that call just keeps getting higher and higher.
So, at the end of the day, that giant 1.2 billion barrel number we started with, it turns out it's not the most important part of the story. The real question, the one we should all be watching, is when and if Beijing finally decides to pull the trigger and start drawing it down. Because that decision, whenever it comes, is going to tell us everything we need to know about the kind of crisis they think they're in, and more importantly, the kind of future they're bracing for.